However, what the government may claim, despite what the government may claim, the facts speak for themselves. According to Castellum AI, the total Russia sanctions placed by the country since 2014 is as follows: US 1,200, Canada 900, Switzerland 800, the EU 766, UK just 271. This isn't leadership, is it? Why is the government so slow?
Foreign Secretary.
We have led on cutting Russia off from SWIFT. We've led on closing our airspace and closing our ports. And if we look at the total financial impact, because the aim here is to debilitate the Russian economy, the sanctions that we have put on banks, defence, aviation and oligarchs add up to $364 billion. For the US, they add up to $340 billion, and for the EU, they add up to $124 billion. So we have to look at the overall financial impact, and it is much higher for the UK than for our allies. But of course, we encourage them all to do more. We need to work together.
Diane Abbott.
Will the Foreign Secretary speak to her colleague, the Home Secretary, about the cruel and chaotic way that desperate Ukrainian refugees are being treated by her department? It cannot be right that there is no visa application centre in Calais. And Ukrainian refugees who travel thousands of miles to Calais are being redirected to either Paris or Brussels. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that this brings the UK into disrepute?
The Home Office have placed staff in Poland and Hungary to help people. They've also, the Home Secretary has announced a new pop-up application site in Lille. And I can tell the Honourable Lady that the Home Office has set up a surgery for MPs in Portcullis House, which I'm sure she would be very welcome to take any cases she has too.
Harry Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this International Women's Day, does the Foreign Secretary agree that a way to amplify the message that we're sending through sanctions to Russia would be to call on every woman in Russia, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, the aunts, the friends of those in the Russian army who are attacking a neighbouring state and causing such misery and suffering, for them to send out a message to those soldiers to stop it and to return home?
Well, my honourable friend is right that, of course, as well as the huge humanitarian crisis this is for the people of Ukraine, it is also seeing the deaths of many Russian soldiers, many of whom have been sent to Ukraine under false pretences. The claim that the Ukrainian people wanted liberation, that simply isn't true. And as we warned in advance of this invasion, President Putin has sent thousands of Russian young men and women to their deaths. And that message is being received in Russia.
Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks into this awful war, Ukraine has suffered terribly, but it stands defiant. Putin is isolated, his economy is in freefall, and his actions condemned around the world. We're united in our desire to ratchet up pressure on Putin. But the UK has sanctioned just 8 of the Navalny 35 list of oligarchs. The EU has sanctioned 19 and the US has sanctioned 15. We welcome the government's U-turn on sanctions legislation yesterday that should help us catch up. But sanctions against oligarchs only work if we know where wealth is hidden. Will the government commit to urgently reform Companies House to leave Putin-linked crooks with nowhere to hide?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, first of all, the honourable gentleman needs to look at the overall size of the sanctions that we've put on. 364 billion of assets have been targeted by the UK, 340 billion by the US, and 124 billion by the EU. And we have led the way, whether it was on SWIFT, whether it was on freezing bank assets, whether it's on closing ports. And as for the point that the honourable gentleman makes about the 2018 Sanctions Act, it was the Labour Party who wanted changes to make it tougher for us to sanction oligarchs. His friend, the chair of the Labour Party, said in the third reading of the bill that the bill gave ministers excessive power which could not be justified for the need for speed. She even called for additional bureaucracy through a cross-Whitehall committee. The U-turn is on his side.
David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, the world watched Putin's premeditated stalking of Ukraine. We saw the lies, the false diplomacy and the manufactured grievances, and then we witnessed the destructive invasion of a sovereign state. Mr. Speaker, this was a crime of aggression. The creation of a special tribunal will help the global community hold Vladimir Putin and his cronies personally responsible for this war, and it would complement the ICC's investigation. Ukraine's foreign minister backs it, several of our allies and partners back it, leading lawyers back it. Will the Foreign Secretary now do the same?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with the honourable gentleman that we are seeing horrific crimes taking place in Ukraine, which are the responsibility of President Putin. That is why the United Kingdom have worked with our allies to put a case to the ICC. There were 38 states, which is the biggest ever group referral to the ICC. I think that is the right route to tackle the war crimes which we consider could have taken place or are taking place in Ukraine. And what we want to do is work with countries to collect the evidence. My right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will be travelling to The Hague to work on that specific issue.
Carper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the strong package of sanctions imposed by the government. But if President Putin is to understand that we're serious, then he also needs to know that we're going to be able to sustain that package of sanctions over a considerable period of time. And he's only going to believe that if we're honest with the public that it isn't just going to be a cost to Russia, but it's also going to have a significant economic cost here, and that we have to make the argument that it's necessary to pay it to keep us safe and secure in the future. And I urge the Foreign Secretary to do so.
Well, of course, there will be an economic cost for British people from these sanctions in terms of their energy bills and their cost of living. But that cost is nothing compared to the cost to the people of Ukraine of this horrific barbarism they're facing. And it is also not compared to the cost of allowing Putin to succeed. Because what we know is if Putin does not lose in Ukraine, then this will not be the limit of his ambitions. He has already been clear that he wants to see a greater Russia that could encompass countries like Moldova and the Baltic states. So it is vitally important that we throw everything at sanctions. We help as much as we can with defensive weaponry into Ukraine, because this is a battle that Putin needs to lose.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The SNP has supported the government's efforts on Ukraine. We took some criticism for that, I have to say, but I think it was the right thing to do. But I have to say in that spirit there is mounting frustration on these benches at the lack of progress and the lack of ambition in the UK's sanctions regime. The rhetoric is simply not matched by the reality. The reality is that the EU has gone further and faster on these sanctions matters. Can I urge the Foreign Secretary to work more closely with the EU, particularly in the due diligence on individual sanctions, and replicate the EU's sanctions in order to actually complement the EU's efforts and have a much more comprehensive sanctions regime, rather than sending them a nice letter with months' notice to sort their financial affairs?
Foreign Secretary.
What the honourable gentleman says simply isn't the case. What we are seeking to do here is debilitate the Russian economy. We have targeted and sanctioned 364 billion of assets. The EU have targeted 124 billion of assets. Yes, there are specific issues over individuals, which we are addressing through the emergency legislation that went through the House and will be in place next week. And we will be able to sanction all the individuals that he is referring to. But it is simply not true to say that the UK has not led on this. We have led on it. We led on SWIFT. We led on banning ships from British ports, which I know the honourable gentleman was arguing for last week. We led on closing airspace to Russian planes. And it simply isn't true what he is saying.
Ms Ross. Foreign Secretary.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3, 5, 10, 18 and 19 together. The United Kingdom has been at the forefront of diplomatic, economic, humanitarian and defensive support to Ukraine. The UK was the first European country to provide lethal aid to Ukraine, and my honourable friend, the Right Honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, is convening a group of countries to do more of that. We're the largest bilateral donor of aid, humanitarian aid to Ukraine, including our largest ever aid match contribution to the DEC appeal, which has now raised over £100 million.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Russian forces are doing to Ukraine what they supported the Assad regime to do in Syria. Starve, bomb and target civilians, schools and hospitals. In Syria, with the support and funding of the UK government, the White Helmets provided vital search and rescue services and other crucial support. This saved thousands of lives and helped to document the atrocities. Will the Foreign Secretary commit to supporting a similar organisation in Ukraine to save lives there?
Foreign Secretary.
What is happening in Ukraine is simply abhorrent. Our current priority is supporting Ukraine through humanitarian aid. We're donating £220 million of humanitarian aid, which is the leading figure in the world, and that will be used to save lives and protect vulnerable people. But I will listen to my honourable friend's suggestion and see what we can do on that front, because we need to do all we can to address this horrendous humanitarian crisis.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know my right honourable friend is as proud as I am that the sanctions we've put on Russia to try and support Ukraine are the most powerful we've ever done in history. But does she agree that we may need to go further and there should be nothing off the table in terms of who or what we're targeting? We need to do whatever it takes to cripple the Putin regime.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right. Nothing is off the table, and we have been working and are working with G7 partners. We want to see them go further in areas like a complete ban on SWIFT, in a complete freezing of all bank assets, and committing to a timetable for reducing dependency on oil and gas, because fundamentally Russia is a state propped up by the oil and gas industry, and in order to really tackle the funding for Putin's war machine, we need to cut off that funding stream.
Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Russia's invasion began, we have seen horrific violence from President Putin against an independent, sovereign nation. And I know this government will continue to support Ukraine against this barbarism and help her to return to safety. Can my right honourable friend confirm that whilst this violence is ongoing, we will do all we can to ensure we offer humanitarian support in the best interests of the Ukrainian people, and detail how communities like North Devon can best assist?
Foreign Secretary.
We have deployed our humanitarian teams to neighbouring countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Moldova. They're working very closely with local agencies. We put in a record sum into our DEC appeal, which is also generating massive donations from the British public. It's very important that rather than donating goods, the public are encouraged to donate cash to the DEC appeal or other trusted charities and aid organisations. What the Polish government have said is that donations in kind generate disproportionate amounts of additional work and cost, which prove ineffective and counterproductive to the needs of those affected. So can I strongly encourage people to donate financially to the DEC appeal? That is the best way to get funding through to the brave aid workers on the front line.
Caroline Anson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I attended a rally on Saturday in my hometown of Eastbourne, where people demonstrated their solidarity with Ukraine and, as she says, donated to the DEC appeal. But that same morning, we saw a series of televised images of very sick children having to be evacuated from the sanctuary and specialist care of their hospital setting under bombardment. Can I ask my right honourable friend what medical support we are providing to Ukraine and to neighbouring countries so these little lambs have a chance?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the United Kingdom is the #1 donor of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, £220 million. We're also doing more than any other country on medical support. The 6th flight of medical supplies went out to Ukraine last night. And I can assure my honourable friend that Foreign Office teams and MOD teams are actively supporting getting very ill children out of Ukraine so they can get the medical support that they need.
There'll be more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the actions this government has taken in response to the distressing humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And of course, across Keighley and Ilkley, we are all deeply concerned about these deteriorating events. So can my right honourable friend confirm that the substantial funding that the government has put in place will deliver the vital support to aid agencies as they respond to this distressing, deteriorating situation?
Secretary.
Well, we can all see how terrible the situation is with 2 million people fleeing Ukraine. We are providing humanitarian assistance, as I've outlined. We're providing Ukrainians with access to basic necessities and vital medical supplies as people are forced to flee from their homes. And we will continue to work with our friends and allies across Europe to deliver as much as we can to those in need.
Catherine McKinnell.
The Foreign Secretary knows that a vital way to help Ukraine is to stop those who've stolen money from the Russian people hiding it in our capital city. But after years of austerity, our hollowed-out enforcement agencies simply do not have the resources to go toe-to-toe with billionaire oligarchs. The world's other major financial centres, New York, doesn't have the same problem, and it takes a much more robust and well-resourced approach to tackling illicit finances. So will she acknowledge that without proper funding of our law agencies that can tackle illicit funding, we can have all the tough laws in the world, but people will still see the UK as a soft touch?
Secretary.
Well, we've established a cross-government task force to enforce the laws we're putting in place on oligarchs. I think it's important to note that the legislation that we passed yesterday will actually reduce the amount of bureaucracy required to sanction oligarchs. So it's going to help target our resources better across the government so we can focus more of our efforts on enforcement. And the honourable gentleman asked me earlier about further measures on transparency. Those are being introduced and we are very committed to that.
Mr. Speaker, I was speaking to friends of mine, Ukrainian friends who live in Kendal, just a day or two ago. They have family in Kiev and family in Crimea. In Kiev, they know exactly, tragically, what is going on. In Crimea, they are completely dark and fed only what Putin tells them. Would she agree with me that one of the ways we can help Crimea, how we can help Crimea and the whole of Ukraine, is to ensure that people within Russia and Russian-controlled territories know the truth of the murderous barbarity being done in their name? Will she be encouraged, I'm sure she is, by the fact that in the last week the BBC's Russian language website has seen a trebling of its number of visits, but that's only 10 million people, there's 150 million in Russia. What can she tell us to help us to make sure information is got to the Russian people?
Tim, sorry, don't take advantage, please, Foreign Secretary.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right about the importance of the BBC in communicating to Russian people and the fact that they have been lied to for years through disinformation, biased state TV, and we are now seeing Putin taking even more repressive measures to stop social media. One of the factors of this crisis is that young people in Russia are less likely to believe the regime because they did have access to social media. Putin is now trying to cut that off. We are working with social media companies about what we can do. We've established a cross-government information unit to communicate with the Russian people directly in Russian language. And the other point I would make is one of the impact of sanctions, and one of the reasons that we've targeted banks, is it sends a message to the Russian people when they are forced to queue for money, when they can't get on the tube, or when they can't access the normal services they've been accessed. And I welcome the actions of corporates in Britain to withdraw their services from Russia, because the message has to get across to the Russian people that the appalling war is being fought in their name.
Ben.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, on the referral to the International Criminal Court, what more can be done to assist in the collection and preservation of evidence, including forensic evidence, of potential war crimes? And I ask the question because if that evidence is held in towns which, heaven forbid, the Russians eventually take, by the time the International Criminal Court asks for it, it may no longer exist.
Exactly. In terms of our ICC referral to the prosecutor, which is now being taken forward. We are working closely with our allies on helping collect that evidence, and it's important we did that early on. This is being led by the Justice Secretary. As I've said, he'll be visiting The Hague to work out how we can make sure we've got that evidence collection. And can I praise the brave British journalists who are currently operating in Ukraine? We saw a terrible attack on the Sky team, completely unforgivable action by the Russian army, and those people are valuable in helping collect the horrendous evidence that is happening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Ukraine's national debt is already crippling their economy. In 2020, it stood at $94 billion. At this truly dark moment, it's unconscionable that it should be required to service that debt or take on more. So can she tell us whether she's had any conversations with other governments, the IMF, the World Bank, G7 or EU foreign ministers, about sweeping debt cancellation for Ukraine, perhaps along the lines of the mutual aid agreement struck by the Allies in World War II?
The Honourable Lady makes a very good point. My Right Honourable friend, the Chancellor, has been discussing this with G7 finance ministers. We are doing all we can to support Ukraine and enabling them to have the finances they need, both to resist Russian aggression, but also eventually to be able to rebuild their country after this horrendous invasion.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with the member from Array who began this question, that, like all bullies, Vladimir Putin demonstrates horrific patterns of behaviour. He helped to starve Syrians in Aleppo and elsewhere, and now he is obliterating Ukrainian cities. But don't we also have to look at our own patterns of behaviour? Because, Mr. Speaker, I see the same administrative failures that hampered our response to Syrian refugees, now limiting that desire that the British public have to help Ukrainian refugees. That administrative incompetence is harming our approach. And can I ask the Foreign Secretary what considerations she has made of the inadequacies of the Home Office on Foreign Office objectives?
We do have to learn the lessons of the past 15 and 20 years where we didn't do enough to tackle Putin, we didn't do enough to tackle Russia, and we allowed the build-up of force, and we didn't respond strongly enough to what happened in Crimea and what happened in the Donbass. And I'm determined to do things differently. That is why the UK is leading on diplomacy, but also on the toughest possible sanctions and on the toughest possible support for the Ukrainian people in their resistance. I've already briefed the House on the Home Secretary's rollout of new centres to help Ukrainian people with the visas. She's opened up a family route, she's opened up a sponsored humanitarian route, and we continue to take that forward, and we are open for refugees.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And today, National Women's Day, we see all trying to escape with their families, with their children, with their mothers and fathers, to reach a place like Poland, which of course has offered refuge to some million refugees, Ireland, several 100,000, but here in the UK, barely 100 being able to find refuge. And this is a shameful lack of humanity in the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in Europe since World War II. Does the Secretary of State agree that this paltry effort to offer refuge is a stain on our otherwise commendable effort to the crisis in Ukraine? And will she urgently work with the Home Secretary, shake up the Home Office and get this sorted?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, as I've said, the Home Office have opened new centres for people to be able to put their applications in. They are running a 24/7 helpline. They do have the surgery for MPs in Portcullis House. And I would also point the Honourable Lady to the fact that we are the largest donor of humanitarian aid, 220 million. We want to help people also settle in region. Many people coming from Ukraine want to settle locally, and we're also helping in that effort by sending our humanitarian teams to the region.
SNP spokesperson Chris Law.
Mr. Speaker. On International Women's Day, Europe is leading and united in welcoming over 2 million refugees, almost all of which are women and children, fleeing the bloody and murderous war by Putin against Ukraine, its citizens. Yet, pitifully, the UK stands at only 300 visas. Shamefully this morning, Mr Speaker, we learn in the Daily Telegraph that while Ireland has waived visas and expects to welcome 100,000 refugees, the UK Government has expressed fears that this will create a drug route to the UK. So on the very day that President Zelensky will address this House, does the Foreign Secretary realise that the Home Office's continued xenophobic and inhumane immigration policy must be for her and her office a complete humiliation, as it undermines the support for Ukraine's people, and will she now call on her colleague, the Home Secretary, either to reverse this policy or to resign?
Foreign Secretary.
As I've said, we've opened up 2 new routes. The Home Secretary has opened up a family route. She's opened up a sponsored humanitarian route. And we're also doing huge support in the region. We're working very closely with the Ukrainian government as well as local governments like the Polish.
Mr. West.
Question 4, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 4, 14, 17 and 23 together. Russia's assault on Ukraine is unprovoked, premeditated, barbaric and an assault on a sovereign democracy. And the UK has committed £220 million of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and the region. We are in regular contact with our allies across the world, as well as international agencies such as the UN and other humanitarian partners and donors, to assess the needs on the ground and to ensure an internationally coordinated response. We call upon Russia to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law.
Liz Twist.
Mr Speaker, it's absolutely vital that those humanitarian corridors remain open to facilitate the safe passage of refugees from Ukraine, as well as the safe passage of humanitarian aid into the country. So what steps has the Minister taken in conjunction with NATO allies to ensure that that happens?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we note Russia's claim of creating humanitarian corridors. These are just not credible. The current humanitarian corridors that Russia have highlighted lead into Russia, and it is an obscene and offensive gesture to the Ukrainian people to invite them to take refuge in the arms of the country currently seeking to destroy theirs. It is not credible, and we call upon Russia to allow proper, meaningful humanitarian access.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. A constituent trying to help her elderly and disabled relatives out of Ukraine described their arduous 19-hour journey from the south to leave for biometric enrolment due to the lack of safe routes in the south. They are now awaiting an appointment in Poland, but who knows how long that will take. They need to know, like others have asked today, what more the Foreign Office will do with the Home Office to make this process quicker and more effective.
Mr Speaker, as my right honourable friend said, the Home Office has established a forward presence, including just over the Ukrainian border into Poland, in order to facilitate cases like the one that she has just raised. We continue working closely with the Home Office to ensure that their work on receiving Ukrainian refugees is quick and as effective and as efficient as possible.
Bel Ribeiro Addy. Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mariupol has been described as a living hell by those who've been subject to the vicious bombardment in the city. Can the Minister say what the government is doing to get people who are under siege, including brave Halo staff, rescued into some safety?
Mr Speaker, the honourable and gallant gentleman raises an incredibly important point. Our ability to project project influence into Ukraine is understandably heavily curtailed. We will continue working to ensure that potential abuses, human rights abuses, are catalogued and put forward for subsequent trials in the ICC and other places if relevant. And I take the point about what more can be done to help the brave people who have stayed behind to do great work in Ukraine, what we can do to help them evacuate the country. I can't give him details at the moment, but his point is well made.
Caroline Downage.
Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has spoken about the work ongoing with the Home Office to process applications of refugees coming over the border into Poland, but we also know people are flooding over the borders into Romania, into Hungary, into other neighbouring Moldova, other neighbouring countries. What more can we do on the ground in those countries to help swiftly get people to our shores?
Minister.
The honourable lady, my honourable friend, raises a very important point. The Home Office have established a forward presence, as we said, in Poland, but also in the other countries bordering Ukraine to facilitate the forward passage for those wishing to come to the UK. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary have made it clear we intend to have a generous offer to the Ukrainian people, a refuge to those seeking that, and we will continue coordinating with the Home Office in their work to establish routes to the UK.
John Burrell.
Partly for humanitarian reasons, there are siren voices suggesting that we should commit to a no-fly zone in Ukraine, notwithstanding our existing support to the country, notwithstanding our commitment to Article 5 and to NATO. Will he assure the House once again that there is no intention to intervene directly, militarily, in this war for a host of reasons, including the fact it would lead to a wider conflict?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the UK should be rightly proud of the support that we gave to the Ukrainian Armed Forces over a number of years through Operation Orbital, through the early deployment of NLAWs, those anti-tank missile systems which have proven so effective, and we will continue to provide support to the Ukrainians in their self-defence. The Secretary-General of NATO has made it very, very clear that it would be wrong for the for NATO to engage directly in conflict with Russia, which is the inevitable byproduct of a no-fly zone. Putin is desperately trying to paint this as Western aggression against Russia. We must not do anything which will allow him to perpetrate that perverse distortion of reality.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But could I ask my right honourable friend, if, God forbid, Russian forces start to deliberately attack nuclear facilities near the western borders, what is my right honourable friend having conversations about contingency plans which need to lead to a mass movement of the refugees already in that area? And would he agree with me that that pretty much constitutes an attack on NATO allies?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we take very seriously the attacks or the threat of attacks against nuclear facilities. Nuclear safeguarding remains a priority for this government. I won't be drawn on the conditions of what might be defined as an attack on NATO, but nevertheless, we have made it absolutely clear that NATO is a defensive organisation. It has never expanded by force or coercion. Our support to the Ukrainians is steadfast, but there is a clear dividing line between an attack on one of our good friends, that is Ukraine, and an attack on a NATO member state.
Minister Pleatgill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This International Women's Day, hundreds of thousands of women are massed in the freezing cold at the borders of Ukraine, traumatised children in their arms as they flee from Putin's bloody, unprovoked war. Families have been separated, thousands of homes destroyed, whole cities cut off from water, food, healthcare and other basic services. This is an evolving humanitarian situation, and the pace and scale of displacement is unlike anything we've seen in Europe for a generation. 2 million refugees have already fled the country, and millions more may cross the border in the coming days and weeks. So can the Minister please tell us today how much of the 220 million announced actually for humanitarian aid is within Ukraine, and that for those that have fled the borders? And will he agree to provide us with a monthly breakdown of pledges against what has actually been dispersed? We've got to act swiftly, and we do need to know what has been dispersed to date. So will he tell us?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes the point this is a rapidly evolving situation. We have made recent announcements of humanitarian support, which are very significant, the largest in the world at this stage. We will, of course, be more than happy to keep the House up to date with the dispersal of that humanitarian aid, and we will do that through the normal means.
Gareth Davis.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
India is the world's 6th largest economy and an important partner for the UK. In May last year, the UK and India committed to strengthening our economic and security relationship through a new comprehensive strategic partnership. Our trade and investment with India is set to grow further, and we continue to work together on security and defence.
Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree that the UK's development finance organisation, British International Investment, has a critical role to play in strengthening our economic ties with India and promoting our entrepreneurial spirit that our two countries share?
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree of the importance of British international investment across the world. And can I point to the very firm statement that the Foreign Secretary gave at the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday when she emphasised strengthen our economic and relationship with India in order to pull them away from the orbit of authoritarian regimes such as Russia.
Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister could, with India now arbitrarily detaining UK nationals such as my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal for over 4 years now and failing to defend the democratic right of national self-determination for Ukraine, how the trade negotiations are going.
Mr. Speaker, can I point again to the very important statement that the Foreign Secretary gave yesterday? It is vital that we continue to strengthen our economic and defence relationship from India. However, I would like to point that the constituency case that he mentioned regarding Jagtar Singh Johal was raised by the Foreign Secretary with her counterparts in India recently.
Andrew Jones.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the UK is working closely with our G7 partners to make it clear our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that we will not accept Russia's campaign to subvert its democratic neighbours. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, is working extensively with her G7 counterparts and met with them in Brussels on the 4th of March to coordinate our response, including robust economic measures, financial sanctions in response to Russian aggression.
Jones.
And I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. Does he agree with me that the situation in Ukraine matters not just for European security, it matters for the whole world, and therefore we need a global response? Our global allies must join us in taking a tough stance on sanctions and strong support for the people of Ukraine. The attack on a democratic nation may have taken place on our continent, but it has significant global implications.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, discussed our potential sanctions response with G7 partners in Liverpool late last year, and he is absolutely right. The eyes of the world are watching our response to this, and the message we must send is absolutely clear, that the G7 and the wider international community, including countries in the Far East, many, many miles from this conflict, are resolute in standing up against this kind of aggressive behaviour, and we will maintain that position.
Minister Stephen Goiter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Minister said about coordination with the G7 on Ukraine. But would he also agree with me that Putin seeks to create instability and insecurity elsewhere in Europe at the same time, including in the Western Balkans, in Moldova and, of course, in the Caucasus? Could he tell us what he's been doing with G7 counterparts and indeed our partners in the EU to address those attempts to create instability across the rest of Europe?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, met with the Prime Ministers and representatives of the Western Balkans just last week. He is absolutely right that we mustn't allow the situation in Ukraine to have a destabilising effect on other parts of the continent, or indeed, as my honourable friend said, other parts of the world. We will continue our close engagement with partners in the region and beyond to ensure that we deal with the situation in Ukraine and do not allow it to have a destabilising effect more broadly.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the free world has woken up to the reality of the cold-hearted ruthlessness of Putin's police state, does the Minister agree with me that the most important thing that members of the G7, who are also members of NATO, can do to secure European security is to raise their defence budgets to levels that we used to spend when faced with this sort of confrontational approach from Russia?
Minister. My right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. The UK is, I think, rightly proud of the fact that we have consistently met our 2% of GDP target for NATO expenditure. We warmly welcome the recent commitment of the German government in what is, I think, a politically bold and incredibly important move to increase their defence spending. This situation in Ukraine is a reminder that peace comes at a price, and we have to be willing to pay that price to maintain peace.
Now go to topicals. Barbara Keeley.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's actions have shattered European security. In response, we've been at the forefront of providing support for Ukraine, stepping up sanctions to debilitate the Russian economy that funds Putin's war machine. isolating Russia on the world stage and strengthening NATO's eastern flank. We cannot have a world where might is right and sovereignty and territorial integrity are trampled. I'm rallying our partners to boost support for Ukraine and strengthen our collective defence.
Barbara Keeley.
Mr. Speaker, there have been reports of several actions by Russian forces in Ukraine which violate the laws of armed conflict, including reports today of the shelling of a hospital in Mariupol. Can I join my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, in underlining how important it is to document these incidents so that those responsible can eventually be held to account for their actions? But also, will the government do all it can to ensure the creation of a special tribunal to investigate the crime of aggression? Because the Ukrainian people deserve justice.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I agree with the Honourable Lady about the appalling atrocities that are taking place and the need to document those atrocities. That's why the UK, with partners, 38 states, put the referral to the ICC, and that's why we're working very hard with our partners to collect that important evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Putin's Russia has been making aggressive statements towards Sweden and Finland. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK should be very supportive of their application to NATO should they decide to apply, and we should look to expedite that, again, should they decide to apply?
Mr. Speaker, NATO has a strong partnership with Sweden and Finland. Our close coordination, I can assure her, will continue. Our relationship with Sweden and Finland extends to our value partnership in security and defence bilaterally and through regional groups such as the Joint Expeditionary Force and the Northern Group. I note closely what she said about future applications to join NATO from these states.
Shadow Minister Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Vladimir Putin's decision to severely restrict the BBC World Service in Russia is, I'm sure we'll agree, an attack on freedom of speech and accurate, trustworthy, excellent journalism. The BBC has provided reliable information to the Russian people as Putin wages an illegal and unprovoked war, which he claims to do in their name. Will the Minister therefore tell us what steps he is taking to ensure that the BBC World Service isn't targeted further in both Russia and across the rest of the world?
Mr. Speaker, this government is firm in its defence of media freedom. This conflict in Ukraine has reminded us, if indeed we need reminding, how important the job of independent, honest journalism is internationally. The BBC World Service is a jewel in the British Crown, and that the Russian language output that they are providing is incredibly important, allowing Russians to understand what is being done perversely in their name.
Rob Butler.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates the dangers of autocratic regimes all too vividly. So can my right honourable friend assure the House that the UK actively supports the right of people to determine their own future wherever they are in the world, not least in Taiwan?
Foreign Secretary.
The world, including China, are watching how we and our partners respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine. The reality is the only thing that Putin and Xi understand is strength. That's why it's so important that we bring more countries into the positive orbit of democratic, free enterprise, freedom-loving economies. And that is what we are working to do with our partners in the G7 and more broadly.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, it's reported today that the UK government regards Ukrainian refugees entering Ireland as a security threat. Women and bairns fleeing Putin's bombs, a security threat. When is this government going to cut the hyperbole, cut the bureaucracy and get these poor souls sanctuary in this country?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has made it absolutely clear that we will open our arms to Ukrainian refugees. The Home Office is working. The Home Office is working to ensure that that is done promptly, and of course we will continue to support the Home Office in the work that they do in this area.
Putin has shown that he's prepared to attack nuclear power plants and has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the importance of maintaining the UK's strategic deterrent as a NATO asset is all the more vital in these dangerous times?
Well, my honourable friend is right about the reckless actions of President Putin and the destabilisation and the attempted destabilisation of nuclear facilities. And the United Kingdom called this out at the UN Security Council. President Putin is trying to distract from his appalling invasion of Ukraine and the fact that it is not according to plan by resorting to increased rhetoric. And we simply shouldn't respond to these threats.
Jessica Morton.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Financial Times reported today that UK taxpayers may be forced to foot a £43 million bill for loans taken out by Russia's biggest coal company and underwritten by the government's export agency. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary if she knows who the International Secretary was at the time that the deal was agreed with one of Russia's richest oligarchs, and whether the Minister in question personally authorised the agreement?
Who wants it? Foreign Secretary.
Well, I know from my time at Trade that those agreements tend to be signed off by officials.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier in the session, ministers mentioned humanitarian corridors. What is being done to ensure humanitarian corridors are safe, secure and appropriate? And what is the UK government doing to uphold international humanitarian laws?
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. As I said in response to an earlier answer, this farcical claim by Russia that they are opening humanitarian corridors eastwards is, of course, a nonsense. Those Ukrainians fleeing the invasion from Russia are typically doing so westwards into those countries bordering Ukraine. My right honourable friends made the point that in support of those people, the best thing that the British people can do wherever in the UK they are is to make cash donations rather than donations in kind. We will ensure that humanitarian support reaches the people that it needs to, and we will continue supporting both at the borders and here in the UK those Ukrainian refugees as they flee conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite Israel and the Arab world, the UK was entirely absent from the process that led to the Abraham Accords in the summer of 2020, and last year's integrated review made no mention of them whatsoever. Does the Minister agree that if the rhetoric of global Britain is to mean anything, surely the UK should be central to encouraging more of our partners across the Arab world to normalise relations with Israel for the good of the whole Middle East?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has made clear her commitment to the Abraham Accords at the Gulf Cooperation Council UK Foreign Ministers meeting on the 20th of December. The UK warmly welcomes the historic steps taken to agree normalisation agreements between Israel, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco and Sudan, and we will continue to work with the US and regional partners to actively encourage further dialogue between Israel and other countries in the region to work towards a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Dr. Jamie Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that in order to deter foreign states from sponsoring or launching cyber attacks on the United Kingdom, that now is the time, especially considering recent Russian aggression, to show the world that Britain is willing and able to retaliate?
Foreign Secretary.
The UK remains vigilant to cyber threats, and we're ready to defend against them, working closely with our allies to deter, mitigate and attribute malicious cyber activity. And we have been very active in calling out the terrible cyber activity by the Russian government. And of course, we will consider all levers of power to protect the UK's security.
Sarah Champion.
Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the former Foreign Secretary commissioned an equalities impact assessment into the government's aid cuts. We have been trying for almost that length of time to get the document into the public domain. Today is International Women's Day. Will the Foreign Secretary publish the report by 4 p.m. today?
Well, the Honourable Lady knows that in the budget we are doing this year, we are restoring the aid budget for women and girls back to its previous levels, and we're also restoring the humanitarian aid budget. But it is a matter of policy that we don't publicly release equality impact assessments because it has a chilling effect and people can't be honest internally. That is why we don't release them. But of course, I'm very happy to discuss the issue with her further.
Like Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my right honourable friend for bringing us on to International Women's Day. Today is obviously an important day for celebrating the actions of so many courageous women around the world. Will she perhaps speak, however, to those who have been made particular victims today, those who have been chased out of their homes, those young women who have been sold into trafficking, not supported as refugees, those women who are even now being brutalised in North Africa as they're being forced over the border as slaves into southern Europe? Will she please speak to the action that her department is taking to defend those women and girls?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely good point about how many women and girls are suffering, and COVID has made that situation worse. That is why we are restoring our humanitarian budget. It's why we're restoring the women and girls budget, and it's why we are working on our prevention of sexual violence initiative to stop that happening, as well as increasing the amount of development spending we are using to tackle human trafficking, working with the Home Office. And we are working on our international development budget. We will be announcing it fairly shortly, along with our overall humanitarian strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the importance of the international events that the House is dealing with this morning is a clear demonstration that the Department is not the right place for the protocol to ultimately be dealt with. But on that vein, can I ask the Secretary of State that the Secretary of State recognises the huge damage being done by the protocol? It's costing £100,000 per hour to businesses in Northern Ireland. It's damaged the sovereignty of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. It's costing haulage 27% increase in prices. Will the Secretary of State now set a deadline, an absolute deadline, to deal with this matter once and for all?
For a second.
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman I am dealing with this matter. I met various European countries last week to discuss reforming the Northern Ireland Protocol, which simply isn't working. What we have is communities in Northern Ireland being treated unfairly. We have an issue of getting goods from GB into Northern Ireland. We've put forward a concrete proposal that will also protect the EU single market, and we need to see movement from the EU.
Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour of representing one of the largest Chagos Highland communities anywhere in the world, and the vast majority of them were absolutely appalled at the Mauritian government's recent publicity stunt, planting a flag on the outer islands of that archipelago. Can I get a reassurance from my right honourable friend that we support UK sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and let me be absolutely clear that the UK is in no doubt about its sovereignty over Biot. We were disappointed Mauritius turned a scientific survey into a political stunt. The raising of Mauritian flags on outer islands of Biot was an unhelpful way to approach a bilateral dispute. We did remove the flags planted by Mauritius on Biot territory. There certainly seems to be a range of reactions from Chagossians to this event, and it's also very interesting to hear of my honourable friend's constituents. And I'd like to pay tribute for all of his work representing Chagossians living in Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is cautioning against donations in kind to Ukraine because of the red tape our exports are tied up in as a result of the Brexit deal. I know that for a fact because I've explored it on behalf of a number of charities in my constituency. So can I ask the Minister this? What action will the Department take to talk to EU counterparts to ensure the flow of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, given the complexity of sending second-hand goods, etc., abroad now?
What the Honourable Lady has said is simply not true. The Polish government, who I think the Honourable Lady should be listening to, and she should take responsibility here, have said that donations in kind generate disproportionate amounts of additional working cost, which prove ineffective and counterproductive. I think, with all due respect to her, the Polish government know more about the situation on the border with Ukraine than she does.
Angel Mills.
What discussions are the government having with our overseas territories and crown dependencies to ensure that the measures we're taking on illicit finance are being supported by them, and those same rules are being introduced in their own territories as well?
Good question.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. The UK and the overseas territories stand united in condemning the Russian government. The UK sanction regimes apply to all of the overseas territories who are in complete step with the UK and our international allies implementing sanctions against Russia.
Tony Lloyd, Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that the National Crime Agency is underpowered, but we know that we have a common interest with our European allies in the search for credible information about those oligarchs who should be sanctioned. So can ministers tell us what steps are being taken to internationalise this search process to make sure we do sanction those who should be sanctioned?
We are working with our international partners. I attended a meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council along with the US and Canada. We are talking about enforcement, we're sharing lists, we're sharing information to make sure that our crime agencies are able to tackle this illicit activity.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Foreign Secretary said that one of the things that pained her the most was the sale of embassy buildings over many years, and she hoped no more of it would happen on her watch. Will she cancel the proposed sale of 45% of our Tokyo embassy estate, which would deeply dishearten one of our closest allies at a time when we are seeking to strengthen the Western alliance?
I share my honourable friend's deep attachment to our Tokyo facilities, and I'm working very hard with our officials on what we can do to make sure that we retain our terrific presence, which is just over the road from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, and any help that my honourable friend would like to give me as chairman of the APP Japan is very welcome, including financial assistance and help with the Treasury.
Mr. Speaker, what representation has the Minister made to our counterpart in Kazakhstan on the use of force by security forces on people protesting against living standards and B, the repression of peaceful protest? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, following the outbreak of violence in Kazakhstan, my noble friend the Lord Ahmed met senior representative of the Kazakh government, including President Tokayev's special representative. In these contacts, he underlined the need to ensure that law enforcement responses are proportionate and in accordance with Kazakhstan's international obligations. He also stressed the importance of the investigation into the unrest being conducted urgently, transparently and effectively.
Maurice Robertson, finally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the world rightly focuses on the terrible events in Ukraine, can I remind the House of the terrible ongoing conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, where women in particular are suffering the most terrible attacks. There's also a potential famine situation. I know the Minister is taking a deep interest in this, but perhaps you could tell us if there's any more that the government can do to help.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for continuing to shine a light on the terrible situation in Ethiopia. It is the world's most severe humanitarian crisis. From north to south, 30 million people require life-saving aid, 5 million displaced people because of conflict, tens of millions of people affected by the drought. In the north of the country, I urge again for all parties to lay down their arms and facilitate the humanitarian access. One truck has got through since December and they need 100 a day. There's a high-scale risk of loss of life, and we must continue to stand with the people of Ethiopia, and especially, as he says, the women and girls on this International Women's Day.
Good. Is it relevant to these questions?
It is indeed, Mr.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you. Following the Foreign Secretary's answer earlier to me about the FCDO's Equalities Impact Assessment conducted in March 2021, I'm seeking your advice, Mr. Speaker, on any other way to encourage her to fulfil her duty to this House, as the Ministerial Code states, to be held to account for policies, decisions and actions
to be as open as possible with Parliament and to refuse to provide information only when disclosure would not be in the public interest. The Foreign Secretary has said the government's practice is not to formally publish equalities assessments and adds her view that this would have a chilling effect on the advice prepared by officials. But this is confusing, Mr Speaker, as a range of equality impact assessments have been published in the past. For example, the coronavirus bill. And no one will be surprised that the former DFID's commissioning of independent reviews of its assessment work in the past, as well as ICAI's also examining such issues. Fundamentally, it is deplorable that the Foreign Secretary used the fact of this assessment to celebrate her department, but will not put the information into the public domain.
Are we ready for an answer? I think it will be helpful. It's very important that scrutiny committees have access to relevant papers and records to do the job the House has delegated to them. The International Development Committee is best placed to assess what information is needed for its inquiries, and I trust that the Government bench has heard the honourable members' concerns and will respond to the committee's request in a timely manner and provide the papers. Right, let us go to the UQ. We come to the UQ. We call on Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Mr Speaker, thank you for granting me this urgent question to ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department if she will make a statement on how her department can speed up the urgent refugee applications coming from those leaving Ukraine.
Okay. Minister. All right.
Mr Speaker, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a barbaric and unprovoked attack.